anyway, he's at the EPA then for 23, and in April of 24, the group that he left gets $5 billion.
Wow.
And there's a lot of connections like that.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and our next guest is James Varney. He is a staff writer at Real Clear Investigations. Jim, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
So I want to talk to you about your piece today on the front page of Real Clear Politics. It's about this problem at the EPA. Tell us what the piece is about.
Well, we had written about this last October. It's they call it the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. It's something that stems from the Inflation Reduction Act. And it was $27 billion in total. $20 billion of that has been much in the news lately because it was given out to 8 nonprofits in a pretty hurried fashion in the last year of the Biden administration. And the new EPA administrator, Lee Zeldin, has been trying to claw it back. So the piece we have today just basically walks the reader through the timeline and shows how they had this compressed period of time to give out more money than the EPA had ever given out before. This was none of the nonprofits that had money like this, and neither had the EPA. So it was a very novel and kind of unorthodox process.
And the point, it sounds to me from reading the article, and I commend it to people, like I say, it's on the front page today, is that they were rushing this money out the door because they didn't want the Trump administration, if they had won, to sort of claw this money back. Is that sort of what explains the sort of rapidity with which this was done?
I think that hasn't been proven. But I think that there is a lot of people speculating that that is something that went on. When they announced the awards in April of last year, I think they were probably still pretty confident about winning. So this September 30th, which is the end of the federal fiscal year, was a deadline that they built in. But of course, April to September 30th is not a lot of time to move $20 billion when you've never done it before.
Right. And
you're giving it to these groups, which in some cases had just gotten their nonprofit status the month before they got the award, or others that had like $100 in assets, and you're giving them billions. So all of that seems like, especially once they started, after Biden dropped out, things seem to have really picked up pace.
Yeah. So part of what sort of makes this interesting, I guess, is this piece that was released by Project Veritas. It's an undercover piece of video with a guy named Brett Efron, who was identified in the Project Veritas video as a special advisor for implementation at the EPA. He was recorded undercover. I think this was in December. So just listen to this and tell me what you think.
It truly feels like we're on the Titanic. We're throwing like gold bars off the It was a insurance policy against Trump winning. So like these are basically like nonprofit institutions that will cover the entire country. They could have been a government agency, but because they aren't, we're safer from Republican system.
So that's part of what animates this, and just it's a little difficult to understand everything he said, but he does say it truly feels like we are on the Titanic throwing gold bars off the top edge. It was an insurance policy against Trump winning because they aren't a government agency, meaning these nonprofits. They are safer from Republicans taking the money back. And you mentioned one of these groups, Power Forward Communities, which is Stacey Abrams is associated with it. And I'm sure you did it. I went to and looked at their 990. That's what you do when you're interested in these things. And you're right. They and people should know the 990. I always tell people about this. Any nonprofit has to file a 990 with the IRS. And you can go online. It's public record, and you can sort of see what they're up to. So when we were talking about this before, a little while ago on the show, I went and looked, and you're right. I mean, they had $100 in 2024. That was their entire budget. And now they've got a $2 billion allocation from the EPA. That just seems strange to me, if nothing else. What do you make of it?
Well, it's remarkable. And, you know, the clip that you played, the Project Veritas thing that came out in December, I think it came out in the first week of December.
Yeah, I think December 4th, yeah.
At that time, the EPA had not yet finalized its memorandum of understanding with Citibank. So what they did was they took this $20 billion, of which the Power Forward Communities is $2 billion, and they moved it out of Treasury control. And the word they use is parked it at Citibank. Now, that then means that you don't have any prior restrictions on the spending. The groups can just go to Citibank. They also get the interest on the 20 billion and take out whatever they want. It's not like they would call the EPA and say, we want to spend $50 million on this. And the EPA says, okay, that sounds good. And they take the money. They would just take the money. Now, EPA would get statements, but they had no real oversight of it. So that was very unusual. And that's, I think, another thing that video that he's referring to is the idea that by building in these removed oversights, they can't get it back. It's already out the door. And that hadn't quite happened yet. So I think that was what he was talking about when he means about flinging off the Titanic. And now power forward communities, the 2 billion wasn't even the biggest one. One group got 7 billion. Another group called the Coalition for Green Capital, it got 5 billion. And what was interesting about that was a guy named Jahi Wise left the Coalition for Green Capital and joined the Biden EPA at the end of 2022. And then in 23, I believe it was, they signed, and they may have even signed the IRA in 22. But anyway, he's at the EPA then for 23. And in April of 24, the group that he left gets 5 billion.
Wow.
And there's a lot of connections like that. We had them, we outlined some of them in our October piece with other groups. So that's just another thing that looks a little untoward. But as we said a moment ago, none of this is proven yet. It's in court right now. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, EPA director has said, Lee Zeldin has said that he wants to claw this money back. Can he do that? Because it sounds like they've, and again, you're right. We don't know for sure, but it sounds like this thing has been designed to make that more difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah, I think Zeldin said yesterday maybe that they had clawed the money back. Now, I'm not exactly sure what's going on. Citibank wouldn't talk to me. And as far as I can tell from the Citibank hasn't done anything, right? I mean, sure, they're a bank. They'll take the 20 billion and deal with it. So I'm not exactly sure where the money is right now or how much of it is left. We spoke with a man named David Super, who's a professor of law and economics at Georgetown. He told me that he thinks there are mechanisms for clawing it back, but that it might be that the way the law is written, they would just have to give the money to somebody other than Citibank. So it's not quite clear, one, if they've got all the money back, and two, if they're going to be able to keep it. That remains to be seen.
Has any of this money been spent so far as we know?
Well, it's hard to say. The groups won't talk. At least they wouldn't talk to me. And if you go to their websites, you do see a few things that have been done. Some of it was in October and November of last year. I mentioned in the story today another group called the Appalachian Community Capital Corporation. It got $500 million. And it talks about it's going to make a $1.6 billion loan pool. See, this is all, I guess, supposed to be green banks, right? Now, that's interesting because one of the stipulations of the money was that they would attract $7 of private investment for every single dollar of federal money.
Yeah, so
500 million, 7 to 1 isn't 1.6 billion.
Yeah, so that is a feature of it, and I didn't know that, and that's in your article, so people should go read it. It's by Jim Varney. It's on the front page of RCP today. But when you say these were supposed to be green banks, basically these nonprofits were supposed to attract other funding, right? To sort of leverage the federal dollars. And according to your article, it's like $7 for every dollar that the feds put into these organizations. That's a big lift. And again, is that something that, was there a time frame in which they had to do that? Because it would seem to me that just looking at their websites, they've got a lot of work to do before they can get to a point where anyone would give them $7 for every buck that they got from the government.
Yeah, there's no question about that. And I spoke with a man named Zeland Hoover, who used to be at the EPA in the Biden administration, and I asked him about that. Because you see, 70% of the 20 billion is supposed to be spent in low income or disadvantaged neighborhoods. Now, I don't know how much organic market there is in those neighborhoods for solar panels and more energy efficient appliances and whatnot. So I said, if there was a market for this, wouldn't the private money already be going there? And he told me that they were trying to create the market, kind of if we build it, they will come kind of model. And that's why one of the reasons that the amounts were so big. And you're right that it's supposed to be a bank and generate loans that would be repaid. But you mentioned a moment ago, Stacey Abrams, she was at the group called Rewiring America. And I'm not sure that she's still with them. But anyway, they were one of the partners with Power Forward Communities. And she was on MSNBC, I think this was last week, and saying that they basically just went out and bought appliances for people. And people thought, well, are you just buying votes? I mean, are we just buying refrigerators and washers and dryers for people? So it's very kind of inchoate what's going to happen with all this money.
Yeah. So that is the question. I mean, Doge is sort of taking some credit for finding this. I guess the EPA is saying they found it. I mean, this was all public knowledge, I will say. I mean, these grants were all announced. It wasn't a big secret or anything. But it sort of has come to a head now. So again, when you look forward, we've got about a minute left here. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think it's interesting that the group that got the $7 billion just happened to draw Judge Chatkin in the District Court of Washington. Her animus towards Trump, I think, is pretty pronounced. She has told the government that she's going to give them till Monday to show that there's been some malfeasance or fraudulent actions. And if not, they supposedly have to give the money back. That's probably just the first step in it.
Wait, when you say give the money back,
back to Citibank? In other words, just put the arrangement that they had back in place.
Right. So the feds have to give the money back to Citibank so that the nonprofits get the money.
Right. I mean, I suppose they could go to Chase or something. I don't know. But in any event, it would free up the money again for these groups to use it.
Wow.
So we'll see what happens with that next week. There's also, and I'm trying to put a story together on this now, there's another $7 billion part of this, which was they called Solar for All. That was more grants than the 8 that made up the $20 billion. And that money, for whatever reason, remained in the Treasury. And the Trump administration froze it. But some of it has gone out to some nonprofits and to states. So we're taking a look at that part also.
Wow. Jim, fascinating stuff. Thank you for bringing us up to date on this. And let's talk again after you do your next installment on this. It's such an interesting story. And it seems like every story that we talk about with the Trump administration ends up with, well, we'll see what the courts say. I mean, that just seems to be the one thing that all these stories have in common.